So there are two kinds of optimality in economics. There's positive optimality, which really means assuming that people do the best with what they have. And there's been a fairly long critique of this, starting with Herbert Simon's work some decades ago on satisficing and bounded rationality, and more modern work by Kahneman and Tversky on behavioral economics. What I want to focus on today instead is normative optimality. That is the idea that economists should find the best policies for governments to implement. Now, optimality can be really useful. For example, suppose you wondered, would a carbon tax really reduce the amount of carbon-based fuels that firms would use? It turns out there's a well-known result, simple result, using optimizing firms, profit-maximizing firms, that quite strongly suggests that the answer is yes. So, theorem, in the short run, optimizing firms, competitive firms, will use less of an input if its price goes up. And then, in the short run to the long run, well, Keynes said in the long run we're all dead. The long run is just a succession of short runs. And each one of those short runs, increasing the price of carbon-based fuels, will decrease the amount used. The proof is quite standard, but I wanted to show it to you just to give you a flavor for how powerful the optimizing idea can be. It's just 2 slides, and I won't go through the mathematics. But my point is, the first slide is understandable by anybody who, let's say any junior in an engineering curriculum at a US university. The second slide is actually a little bit more complicated, but, and I have to admit I made a mistake when I was cutting and pasting. The last sentence should, read, since the previous slide showed that pi was convex, the session is positive semi-definite, so the signs are wrong. That's what you get when you cut and paste without paying enough attention. But the point is that in 2 slides, with just a little bit of mathematics, you can show that any competitive profit-maximizing firm, regardless of what its technology is, or almost regardless of what its technology is, we'll get back to that, has downward sloping input demand curves. So if you raise the price of carbon-based fuels, they'll use less of those fuels. This is a very attractive way of thinking about things. The problem is that that the world isn't set up in a way that we can always engage in this kind of thought. In some cases, optimal plans are impossible to formulate even in principle. So, let me give a concrete example about the way economists think through environmental problems, sustainability problems. So, should whales be allowed to go extinct? The paradigm is you calculate the cost of saving the whales, you calculate the benefits of saving the whales, and then if the benefit is greater than the cost, you save the whales, otherwise you don't. And you have to put everything in dollar terms so that you can add up the costs and benefits. And the idea is not to have experts make the decisions, but to ask everyday people what their preferences are, what their evaluation is. So that's the paradigm. And what I'm interested in discussing today is, to what extent can this work? So don't ask experts, ask lay people. So getting back to whales. The cost of saving the whales, well, the lost profits, because if you save the whales, then you can't sell as much whale meat. The lost enjoyment of the people who like to eat whales. And then we have to sum these overall future generations, because the decision we make is going to be irrevocable. The benefits of saving the whales, more profit from ecotourism, the psychic benefit to ecotourists, so it's not just a monetary value. Existence value means that there are people who care about the whales, even if they aren't ecotourists, and that has to be taken into account. Their valuing of just knowing that whales are around, even if they never see the whales. Option values means you value the ability to do number 1 and number 2 in the future. And bequest value means you may care about the ability of future generations to do number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then finally, summing these over future generations means we have to know how each generation thinks about 1, 2, and 3, and add those all up. Now, of course, already this is problematic. How do we know how 10 generations from now are going to value whales? But there are other problems that I want to talk about. In order to do this and get good values from lay people, the lay people have to have full, unbiased information. Now, what exactly does that mean? For example, for climate science, first the people have to be able to trust climate scientists, the right climate scientists, whoever they are, we'll get back to that, and then learn what those trusted people know. So you need to ask of the climate scientists, are they trustworthy? And then if they are trustworthy, are they right? Which are separate issues. And then can lay people learn what the climate scientists know? And how long and at what cost is it going to take for the lay people to learn it? And also, by the way, once they learn it, are they really still lay people? So I want to investigate this idea of trusting experts. So first we need to admit that government by the highly educated isn't automatically gentle or benevolent. And I'll just put one example on the board to, I think, prove the point. And government by the less technically skilled isn't automatically bad. Utah is widely regarded, actually, as one of the best managed states in the nation. And if you doubt that, ask anybody from another state how big their rainy day fund, the rainy day fund is in that state, particularly their per capita rainy day fund. So I might disagree with some of the decisions of the Utah legislature, but they do some things much better than the vast majority of other states. Even though, well, here's a note from the Salt Lake Tribune in 2005 that the legislators' interim education committee couldn't figure out whether 3 out of 5 was greater than or less than 2/3. Furthermore, we need to acknowledge that there's a long tradition in the U.S. of mistrusting experts or academics. Just go back to George Wallace talking about the pointy-headed intellectuals, and William F. Buckley famously saying he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard. And finally, when we hear arguments like 97% of climate scientists think this and therefore it's true, from a logical point of view, that's a fallacy. We even have a fancy Latin term for it. So when Representative Chris Herrod says, please convince me with the science, not simply by saying there's a consensus, he has a point. And particularly as an economist, I'm sensitive to this. There's certainly been lots of cases where the consensus of economists has been wrong. In fact, the whole idea of the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal orthodoxy that the free market always knows the best thing, has been the dominant paradigm in economics in the last 20 years, and I hope we now realize that it's wrong. But it's not clear that that we can accept Representative Herrod's invitation convincing with the science. The questions are, can a layperson learn the science, and at what cost? That's my older point. I mean, okay, if you want to take up his invitation, well, here's some science. This is from an article about climate change, emissions, concentrations, and temperature, written by some econometricians. And I pulled a random paragraph from the article. It's, you can tell from the title of the article, it's trying to see whether there is a link between emissions of, anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases and temperature. And they claim that it is, but and this is just one paragraph where they're working through, are the statistics good enough? Now, I'm not an econometrician. Even I only understand about half of this. So that's the end of the paragraph. So at the end of the paragraph, they're wondering whether one should use the more conservative newly West standard errors for the co-integrating coefficient. It seems to me we don't have an alternative, but to trust experts. If we were going to start not trusting experts, do we not trust doctors? Do we not trust judges? Do we not trust engineers and architects? I mean, I don't see many of us running for the exits because we're wondering whether the engineers and architects who designed this building did a good job or whether the roof is going to fall in. Teachers? Even historians. I mean, I certainly trust historians when they tell me that a president named Abraham Lincoln existed, but I don't have proof that a president named Abraham Lincoln existed. I've seen photographs that purport to be of Abraham Lincoln, but I don't know for sure that that's really Abraham Lincoln. I've read things that Abraham Lincoln was supposed to have said, but again, I do it on trust that historians say that Abraham Lincoln said this. I don't really know. Not trusting would have huge economic costs. Indeed, I think it would negate the huge efficiencies that we get from division of labor that people as far back as Adam Smith have identified. Because if you don't trust experts, then you're going to do everything yourself. You'll be a jack of all trades. So where does that leave us? Experts have educated guesses, sometimes from working on a problem for decades. If we have no choice but to trust them, is there some way to make it less risky to trust the experts? Well, that strikes me as being actually an economic problem. It's in a framework called principal-agent problems. The key characteristic of principal-agent problems is there's an information asymmetry. There's a principal who hires an agent to do something. The agent has specialized knowledge that the principal doesn't have. The principal hopes that the agent works in the principal's best interest. That's why the principal hired the agent. But the agent has different objectives, different motivations than the principal. And so the asymmetric information becomes a problem. Can the principal trust the agent to do what the principal wants the agent to do? So now it's not always related to experts, but often is. So for example, a patient hires a dentist, and he hopes that the dentist does the right thing, but he can't judge whether the dentist is doing the right thing with his teeth. A client hires a lawyer. The layman reads a climate scientist's work. A stockholder hires a manager. Certainly the stockholders in Lehman Brothers weren't well served by the managers. A mortgage broker, a borrower hires a mortgage broker. That's flipped. A citizen hires, in some sense, a civil servant. Now, there are non-expert examples as well. An example of a slave owner and a slave, the slave owner doesn't know exactly how hard the slave is working. The slave knows that. And so there's this information asymmetry there as well. But I want to concentrate on these expert examples. We have an older term, conflict of interest, which captures this. And I think it's inherent whenever division of labor accompanies asymmetric information. And in that sense, it's probably an ever-present dilemma in modern societies because of how far the division of labor has gone, how many experts we need to use. So the agent is pulled in two directions, his own objectives and the objectives of the person that's hired him. And it strikes me that, at least in some sense, perhaps it's a little bit similar to the tension in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, which talks both about promoting the general welfare, which is an idea that you should be selfless and care about the general welfare, not about yourself. And that you also, the purpose of the Constitution is also to secure the blessings of liberty. And at least part of what liberty means is you don't have to care about anybody else. You just do what you want to do. So is there a technological fix for principal-agent problems? Well, for some of them, there is. And there's a whole new field of economics called mechanism design, which is an attempt to try to come up with fixes. Monitoring, incentive realignment. I can assure you that lots of people in Wall Street are wondering how to more appropriately align the incentives of the managers with the stockholders so that the stockholders don't lose all their investments like they did in many banks and financial institutions. But I'm not sure there's a technological fix to all principal-agent problems. And I want to suggest maybe we need, or maybe it could be helpful to have attitudinal fixes, which I think of as being in two groups, professional ethics and social solidarity. So let me explain. The idea of professional ethics is quite clearly articulated in law and medicine, but it's not articulated in most other fields of academics. Certainly it isn't in economics. And perhaps it's time to introduce into our formal curricula discussions of the ethical ways that experts should go about doing things. For example, if I had time, I'd now, as an economist, hopefully an ethical economist, go back to my slide on the proof of that theorem and talk about what does it really mean that the price vector is assumed to be constant? What does it really mean that the input-output set was assumed to be convex? And we'd have a discussion about that. Also in business, there's an idea of servant leadership, which could usefully be used to bring ethical ideas into business. I mean, there is some discussion of ethics already in the business curriculum. Fiduciary responsibility is actually a topic of some legislation in Congress right now. And social solidarity, national service might be one kind of way of increasing trust between citizens of a country. For example, I speculate that maybe one reason why the US Senate, let's say, was a more collegial body in the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s than it is today is because almost all the senators were veterans of the Second World War. And so in some sense they had gone through that traumatic national experience. They trusted each other in ways that I think US senators today don't. They haven't had that experience. Now, another method of social solidarity is political and moral indoctrination, but one doesn't want to go too far. I think you should be careful not to tip things too far in the other direction. So let me turn from trusting experts to the next section, which is, are the experts right? Forecasting the optimal solution to environmental problems often involves forecasting very complicated scientific and economic systems, which are non-experimental, which mean we can't run experiments in the economy, we can't run experiments in terms of global climate change. So the main tools that scientists have to discover what are good ideas and what are bad ideas, we don't have in this framework. And it involves decades or centuries into the future. Certainly global climate change involves things that already we've changed, in my opinion, we've changed the climate for a few centuries into the future. So this is hard. In fact, understanding these natural systems is harder than understanding any kind of systems that humans have created. For example, it's humans that created current computer or econometric models of global climate change. It's humans that created the mathematical arguments that I used earlier. It's humans that created the idea of, I like this quote, credit default swaps on the AA tranche of a subprime collateralized debt obligation. These are all things that humans created, but in understanding these problems related to sustainability, we have to try to understand these natural systems that are a lot more complicated. To illustrate just how hard it is to think about these problems, think about how one would try to answer, quote, find the probability of a more than 20% drop in GNP due to global climate change in 2035 if we've taken no climate protection measures. That concerns the future. What I want to claim is that we can't even answer a methodologically similar question about the past. And obviously, it's a lot easier to think about the past than it is about the future. But here's the example. So what was the probability that the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 1944, would be successful? It certainly wasn't 100%. Dwight Eisenhower wrote 2 speeches to give 24 hours after the invasion started. One speech he would deliver if the invasion was successful, and the other speech he would deliver if the invasion was unsuccessful. So it certainly wasn't a probability of 100%. It certainly wasn't a sure thing. Obviously, it wasn't 0 either because it succeeded. But how would we ever know, for example, if the right probability was 84.7%? We can't run D-Day 1,000 times over and check whether 847 times the Allies were successful and the other times they weren't. And formulating optimal plans about the future requires knowing these unknowable probabilities. So to summarize where we are at this stage, the optimizing cost-benefit analysis approach to deciding what economists should recommend to governments involves trusting experts, but there are issues of whether they're trustworthy and whether they're right, and then learning what the experts know, but that's quite problematic. So what's the alternative? What would a non-optimizing approach to making policy recommendations look like? Well, I don't think it'll change basically what economics is about, which is the allocation of scarce means among competing ends. But it might expand that along the lines of Herman Daly's ends-means spectrum. Daly's an economist who's now at the University of Maryland. Traditionally, economists just look at the intermediate means and the intermediate ends, but perhaps we should look broader, encompassing a real understanding of the ultimate means, such as what the climate scientists are telling us about climate. But also, perhaps even more importantly, or just as important, but something that we really don't talk about in economics these days, which is the ultimate end. What are we harnessing the Earth's ultimate means for? What's our purpose? So that economists might need to study not only ethics in order to alleviate these principal agent problems, but also some discussion of what the meaning of life is. Now that's not going to result in optimal perfect answers. But maybe that's okay, not to have optimal perfect answers. So what do I mean by policies that aren't precisely optimal? Well, marine reserves is one of them. Marine reserves are like national parks in the ocean. And the idea is, instead of doing what I teach graduate students to do, which is to calculate precisely how many tons of a certain species of fish ought to be taken out of the ocean every year, you instead say, well, we're not sure we know how to solve those problems correctly. So let's set aside some parts of the ocean where there's never going to be any fishing, just in case we get something wrong. Now, exactly how big should those reserves be? What's the optimal number of acres? We don't know, but perhaps that's okay. Perhaps taking reasonable guesses is good enough. Another one would be industrial policy. In the last 20 years, almost all economists have been taught that the government ought to take its hands off of micromanaging the economy. But actually, micromanaging the economy is done pretty nicely for example, the People's Republic of China. So maybe we have to rethink that. Do we know for sure what the optimal sectors are for the economy for the government to subsidize? No, we don't. But maybe it's okay. Now, throwing optimality out the window isn't the answer to all problems, and certainly there are lots of bad policies that could result too. So what would these not precisely optimal policies look like in terms of sustainability? Well, I don't know, but let me put up for consideration Nicholas Sturgis-Rowan's minimal bioeconomic program. I wrote this in 1972. It's a paper called Energy and Economic Myths, but there's also a book by that name. Now, there's no optimality proof here, but let's just talk through some of his ideas. And it's actually my last slide. So here's his minimal bioeconomic program. Number one, prohibit the production of all instruments of war, because war is completely economically wasteful activity. Number 2, aid underdeveloped countries in attaining a good life, a good standard of living. Druzhevsky had a very interesting suggestion on how to do this. He suggested instead of all kinds of foreign aid programs, the simplest way to do this is simply to abolish all immigration restrictions. He said, and I agree, there's no ethical reason why the life prospects of a child born 1 mile south of the US-Mexican border should be any different than the life prospects of a child born 1 mile north of the US-Mexican border. And if you did eliminate all immigration restrictions, and he didn't mean merely the US eliminating it, but all countries in the world eliminating immigration restrictions, then I think you'd much more rapidly achieve standard number 2, or at least a more equitable worldwide income distribution. And number 3, attain a human population level consistent with sustainable agriculture. Now, sustainable agriculture means an agriculture that doesn't depend on exhaustible resources. So it doesn't depend on tractors and other farm implements that use gasoline based from petroleum. It doesn't depend on fertilizers that are manufactured from petroleum. It's sustainable in all its aspects. Number 4, avoid all waste of energy. Number 5, cure ourselves of the morbid craving for extravagant gadgetry. We've had lots of examples since 1972 of exactly what that means. And number 6, get rid of fashion. He wrote, to get a new car every year and refashion the house every other is a bioeconomic crime. Number 7, to make durable goods more durable and more repairable. And number 8, to reorganize work life. Because, quote, an important prerequisite for a good life is a substantial amount of leisure spent in an intelligent manner. Now, I can't prove, and nobody can prove, even he didn't try to prove that these were optimal. But the idea is, maybe that's okay. Maybe these kinds of ideas are important anyway. Okay, well, I took less time than I thought, but at least I didn't take the time to go through the proof. I'm sure you enjoyed that.